king to live with great courage and to die leaving an everlasting fame. Macedonians, why do you retreat? We want to live forever!
Alexander the Great, everybody. But first, hello, my name is Garvin and I read things and chatter about them on the internet for your entertainment. Today we're looking at the myth of Alexander the Great, the stories that grew up around his birth, his life, and his death. And we're going to start by looking at the Greek Alexander romance. Let's turn to. To start with a note on sources, there are several different versions of the Alexander romance. For example, there's a Persian one that became very popular in the Islamic world. There's an Armenian version. There's a medieval version that was pretty widespread throughout Western Europe. There's an Ethiopian and a Syrian version, and I believe there's a Russian version as well, although I haven't been able to pin that one down. Basically, I'm telling you there's a lot of different versions of this story. What I'm using is the translation by Richard Stoneman entitled The Greek Alexander Romance, published by Penguin Classics, and I'll have a link to it in the description. This video is meant as a brief summary, and as time goes on, we'll make more videos expanding with more details. That said, if I left out your favorite part, please let me know in the comments, or if I did cover your favorite part, let me know, or even if you just have a favorite part of the Alexander mythos in general. This version of the myth starts in Egypt before Alexander's birth, where the last pharaoh, who is a powerful wizard who uses spells to defend the kingdom, his name is Nectanebo, and when he sees in a magical vision the very gods of Egypt leading the armies of Persia to conquer his realm, well, he knows the jig is up, so he loads himself down with as much gold as he can carry from the treasury, and without telling anyone, flees. Great guy. He runs to Macedonia, and he starts making his living as a prophet, using his magic abilities to basically convince people to give him money. And this is where he runs into Alexander's mother, Olympias, who has her own issue. She's been married to King Philip for some time and has no kids. For a queen, this is a problem, and Philip is starting to talk about looking around for a new wife who can give him kids. Nectanebo promises to arrange for a god to visit her and she can get pregnant that way, which is a solution, I guess? He then uses his magic to create dreams of a god visiting her, and when she gets very excited about this, disguises himself as the god Amon to sleep with her and father Alexander. I just want it known for the record, I do not like this guy. The announcement of Olympias' pregnancy leaves Philip suspicious, and Nectanebo decides to use his magic to convince Philip that a god slept with his wife, because if you're a king and a man sleeps with your wife, well, you kill the man. If a god sleeps with your wife, what can you do? Nectanebo's first plan is to conjure dreams, but it turns out Philip doesn't believe a damn thing he hears in his sleep. Bad news for the pharaoh. So Nectanebo turns to plan B, which is turn into a giant seahawk, fly to Philip's military camp, alight in front of him, and in a human voice prophesies to him that a god slept with his wife and will give birth to a world-conquering son. I don't like the guy, but I gotta be honest, that's a heck of a plan B. Philip hears the giant seahawk out and decides he doesn't quite buy it, which there's skepticism, and then there's this. So Nectanebo turns to plan C. He waits for Philip and Olympias to throw a big dinner party and shows up as a giant snake, cruises in while everyone is terrified, and then coils up around Olympias and acts tame and coy. And this convinces everybody that the giant snake must be a god in disguise, and that God is really into Olympias, because what other reasonable explanation can there be for this? And just to make sure he's around in case anything else goes south, he gets Olympias to hire him as the court astrologer. I really don't like this guy. So Alexander is born with Philip naming him and declaring him heir to the throne, but even as a baby, everyone can tell Alexander doesn't look anything like Philip. To be fair, he doesn't look anything like anybody. To describe him, the story says this. In shape, he was a man, but his hair was like a lion, and his eyes were mismatched. The right one black and the left one white. His teeth were as sharp as nails, and he moved with the suddenness and decisiveness of the lion. This is a fairly terrifying description if you ask me. Imagine running into a guy like this in a dark alley. There is one thing that detracts from the terror, though. According to the Alexander romance, Alexander is under 5 feet tall. So Alexander the Great is gremlin-sized? The teeth are still scary, though. We can all agree on that, right? Teeth as sharp as nails. That's scary. Alexander isn't the only terrifying thing in Macedonia, though. During his childhood, a horse is born, which is fairly normal, but this horse eats people. The grooms bring this horse to Philip, who decides to do the rational thing and put this large and growing man-eating horse into an iron cage and feed it condemned criminals. So don't commit crimes in Macedonia. They'll feed you to giant man-eating horses. Alexander, of course, tames this horse by just showing up on his 15th birthday, wanting to see the killer horse, which is the most believable thing about this story. Because, of course, a 15-year-old boy is going to hear about a man-eating horse and be like, I gotta see that. Bucephalus, because that's who this horse was, sees Alexander and immediately submits to him because Bucephalus recognizes the main character when he sees him. Alexander then goes to Nectanebo and asks him to take him out to the country to learn more about the stars, and promptly kills him by shoving him to a pit. Why is kind of up in the air. I feel like the story didn't really explain that very well, but all things considered, I'm willing to spot Alexander one murder as a treat. For me, honestly, it's a treat for me. That said, before finally expiring, the old pharaoh tells Alexander that he is his real father, and then prophesizes that Alexander will one day conquer the world, and encourages him to kick the crap out of those dastardly Persians. Alexander then goes home, and then pulls a hat trick by convincing Philip to let him compete in the chariot races in the Olympics, which he handily wins, despite several competitors plotting to kill him. Alexander, of course, kills them first, because that's the kind of story this is. When Alexander is 18, Philip is unfortunately killed by trickery when a neighboring king full of lust for Alexander's mother catches him alone, kills him, and then tries to kidnap her. Alexander was away with an army at the time, but not far away enough for this guy to get away. So Alexander catches the guy, defeats him in battle, kills him, and then he decides it's time to do what else but
Try to take over the world.
Thanks, Brain. Now, it's here that the story breaks down a bit for me, because in one section he's waging war on Tyre, and then he just kind of teleports back to Greece to destroy Thebes, and then he teleports over to Egypt, where he goes through a series of mystical events that lead to him founding Alexandria and meeting the god Serapis. Serapis is a syncretic deity. A syncretic deity is a deity created by merging 2 or 3 more gods, and he was heavily promoted by the Ptolemies, and there's no evidence that Serapis was worshipped or that his cult even existed in Alexander's time, but this is a myth that was written several centuries after Alexander was dead. Now, I will say it's interesting that this story spends a lot of time linking Alexander, the Egyptian god Ammon, and Serapis, as well as declaring Serapis to be the greatest god in the world that we should all be part of his fan club of, which makes this whole section really convenient for the Ptolemy dynasty. It's almost like this myth is serving a political purpose, but moving on. The book starts to focus on Alexander fighting the Persians, and of course people keep swooning over how just gosh darn heroic and manly Alexander is. And to be fair, he's doing things like tying candles to the horns of sheep to make his army look bigger in the night, and disguising himself as a messenger to infiltrate Darius's court to speak to him directly, so he is doing some pretty clever and heroic stuff. The book also holds a series of letters supposedly exchanged between Alexander and Darius. Darius is trying to convince Alexander to go away, while increasingly getting more afraid of Alexander as he just keeps winning. And Alexander is trying to convince Darius to come out and fight and have one big glorious battle for the fate of everything. There are also letters between Darius and Porus, an Indian king, setting up Porus as Alexander's next big enemy. War ends when Bessus and other Persian nobles betray Darius and basically stab him to death one night. Alexander is close enough that he hears the violence and comes running, managing to break into the Persian camp and finding Darius lying on the ground bleeding to death. He grabs Darius, and Darius, in his last moments, commends his family and his empire to Alexander, because better him than those dirty, no-good traitors. Alexander is enraged by this betrayal and hunts down these nobles and kills them. After this is done, Alexander takes his army and marches to fantastical places, where he runs into things like fruit trees that grew apples the size of melon, in a land where men grew to the size of giants. And after passing through that land, he found men who were 6 feet tall and dressed in lion skins, who used logs as weapons and defended their homes with 3-eyed guard lions, which honestly sounds kind of awesome. He found trees that grew during the day but shrank at night, crabs big enough to catch and eat horses. He did find friendly natives as well, men who had no heads but spoke human languages and were willing to trade and feed his army as guests. Through these fantastical places, he reaches the lands of darkness, and he knows if he can get through there, he'll reach the lands of the blessed, where the gods live, and he might be able to win immortality. But there's no sun, hence the name Lands of Darkness, so he decides rather than lead in his entire army, he'll take a small strike group of young men. One of the older soldiers, however, convinces his sons to smuggle him along with the strike group, and that ends up being best for everyone, because the strike group gets lost, and it's the older man who figures out a way for them to travel by creating a base camp where they keep the foals of the army, and having the strike groups ride out with the mothers of those foals in their explorations, and then letting the mares lead them back to camp. In one of those explorations, they unknowingly found the spring of the water of immortality, but the only one to figure that out is a cook who tells no one, keeping the water for himself, which, I'm gonna be honest, I think that's a dick move. I wouldn't blame him for drinking some, but dude, share with your fellow soldiers at least. I understand not wanting a king to be immortal, but you serve with these guys. There's gotta be at least a couple guys in this unit you're willing to share with, otherwise why are you here? Alexander finds out about this because the cook tries to bribe his daughter with some of this water, and she takes the bribe, but she feels bad about it, so she goes and tells her father. And Alexander's response is to banish his daughter and have this guy thrown into the sea with a millstone wrapped around his neck, which I feel is a bit of an overreaction, but you tell me in the comments. Now, this isn't the first version of this story I've heard. I mentioned one earlier in my mermaid series, where it was Alexander's sister who took the water, and she was turned into an immortal mermaid cursed to roam the sea forever. Interesting versions either way. After this, Alexander runs into 2 birds with human faces and voices who tell Alexander he is pushing too far into immortal lands and it's time to go back. Saddened, Alexander accepts this, turns around and leaves. This is how you know it's a myth. And he decides to take a consolation prize. He's gonna conquer India, so he heads down to fight with Porus, the king of India. And the battle is immense and draining, and eventually Alexander decides the only way to settle this is to challenge Porus to a 1v1 fight for everything. Porus is over 8 feet tall, and Alexander is an under 5 foot gremlin of a man, so this doesn't seem like a wise idea to me. That said, in the story, Alexander kicks his ass and kills him, so what do I know? After this, Alexander visits the Brahmins, who are written as naked philosophers who dwell apart from the rest of the Indian people, rejecting vanity and vainglory and material possessions. And after a conversation with the leader of the Brahmins, Alexander decides the only thing he can do is leave them in peace, so he takes his army and he goes his way. Alexander at last decides to turn back and head back to Babylon, which he has made the capital of his empire, although along the way he stops to see the homeland of the Amazons, and through a diplomatic exchange of letters convinces them to submit to him as their new overlord. And he also goes to see the old homeland of Semiramis. And some of you may remember I did a video on her way back in the Mermaid series that I've already mentioned, so I'll link that video in the description as well. Of course, Semiramis is long gone, but her lands are ruled by a new queen, Queen Cadmus. And there's some awkwardness here because at least one of Queen Cadmus's sons was a big supporter of Darius. However, while traveling to that land, Alexander runs into one of her other sons who was traveling with his family, and he got attacked and his wife got kidnapped. So Alexander disguises himself as his loyal bodyguard Ptolemy. I just realized I mispronounced that earlier, so I apologize. And Disguised as Ptolemy, leads the army to rescue this guy's wife and deliver her to Queen Cadence, getting to see the whole palace and the whole kingdom in disguise. Queen Cadence, of course, knows exactly who he is and calls him out in private, but is amused by his audacity, so she's gonna let it slide. And it's after all of these adventures, Alexander returns to Babylon, where he is poisoned and dies. But before his end, Bucephalus, his horse, hunts down his poisoners, drags them before Alexander, and kills them. So Alexander dies with a smile. The generals argue where to bury him, but the oracles of Babylon declare that he is to be buried in Egypt under the care of Ptolemy, which is once again pretty convenient for him and his dynasty, isn't it? This is a bit of a bare-bones summary, but it gives you an idea of the myth and its themes, and it's what we're going to use as a base going forward, as we will make other videos about the Alexander romance in the future. There are a number of competing story versions and editions that are worth discussing, and we will get to those. For example, there are Jewish stories, most likely written by the Jewish community of Alexandria, about how Alexander converted to the worship of the Almighty upon meeting the priest of Israel. There are stories about Alexander trying to explore the sky and the depths of the sea and being told by the gods to stick to his lane. The myth of Alexander has him constantly pushing the bounds of what is acceptable for a mortal and seeking to explore just past those bounds or learn just a little bit more than what man was meant to know. So, in these stories, Alexander isn't just some conquering warlord, although he is that. He is in a sense an avatar for humanity's desire to go further, go higher, go deeper, and learn more to surpass the bounds set on us by the very universe. And to be honest, I think he would like that. But maybe I'm just being taken in by the myth. It's on this note that I'm going to stop this week's video. I think this was a fairly bare-bones summary of the Greek Alexander romance, but it is a mythology that could sustain a vast number of videos, and there will be more videos in the future. I hope you found this video, though, informative, or at least entertaining, and if you did, please leave a like, comment, or consider subscribing, as that helps me in my eternal battle with the dread Lord algorithm. Terror be on his name. You can also support me by joining my Everwise patrons, where $1 a month gets you a vote on upcoming content, like this video. Next week, we're going to do one more video about the Alexander romance. I hope you join me for that, but until then, take care of yourself, take care of each other, and of course, keep reading.